Father Frank Pavone, who most of you probably know. Father Frank Pavone is one of the most prominent pro-life leaders in the world. Originally from New York, he was ordained in 1988 by Cardinal John O'Connor, and since 1993 has served full-time in pro-life leadership with his bishop's permission. He is the National Director of Priests for Life, President of the National Pro-Life Religious Council, and the National Pastoral Director of the Silent No More Awareness Campaign and Rachel's Vineyard. He travels extensively, both nationally and internationally, preaching and teaching against abortion. He produces programs for religious and secular radio and television networks. He was asked by Mother Teresa to speak in India on the life issues and has addressed the pro-life caucus of the United States House of Representatives. He has served the Vatican as a member of the Pontifical Academy for Life and has worked for the Pontifical Council for the Family, which coordinates the pro-life activities of the Catholic Church. An outspoken advocate for Terri Schiavo, he was at her bedside as she died. In 2011, Father Frank flew to Canada to remove a terminally ill baby from the hospital that was on the verge of disconnecting his ventilator. Baby Joseph Marashli lived at home for 6 more months with his parents and older brother. Father Frank was invited by members of the class of 2009 at Notre Dame to lead an alternate commencement ceremony for those students who refused to attend the ceremony in which President Obama was honored. Father Frank was invited by members of Congress to preach at the prayer service they had in the Capitol just prior to the vote on health care reform. He received the Proudly Pro-Life Award by the National Right to Life Committee and numerous other pro-life awards and honorary doctorates. He is the author of 4 books. The most recent, Abolishing Abortion, was published by Thomas Nelson in August. Proclaiming the Message of Life is due out this spring from Servant Books. Norma McCorvey, the Jane Roe of the Supreme Court's Roe v. Wade abortion decision, called Father Frank the catalyst that brought me into the Catholic Church. Father Frank.
Well, thank you, Leslie, and thank you, brothers and sisters, for coming this morning to what we consider to be a key moment in launching the elections of 2016. We are in the new year. We are in an election year. As we've all experienced, we've been in the election season for quite a while already, but that's okay. We believe that's good. We believe that's good because we believe that the people of America need to pay more attention to who it is that's seeking their vote, that the people of America need to pay more attention to what the process is by which people get our votes and why that matters. We therefore decided to have this press conference to begin a series of communications to the American public about what we as a ministry of Priests for Life intend to do to help the people of God take their proper role in the elections of 2016. This is not about the church becoming a political machine. This is about the church becoming more the church. This is not about the church doing the job of a political party or a particular candidate's campaign. This is about the church doing her job of activating, informing, not only educating, but inspiring the people of God to do what it is that they need to do, not only as citizens of heaven, but citizens on earth, citizens of the United States of America. What are they called to do, and how are they to do it? The church is equipped to carry out that task, because that task is part of the Great Commission. When our Lord said prior to ascending back into heaven, "Go and make disciples of all the nations, and teach them to carry out everything I have commanded you." What we do, what we're going to announce in this and subsequent press events about our role in the elections of 2016 flows completely from the Great Commission. It doesn't flow from the platform of a political party. It flows from the Great Commission given by Jesus Christ. And our point is that because it flows from that Great Commission, we have the freedom to carry it out. Because it's Jesus Christ telling us to teach, to form people, to activate people, to make disciples of people, to make a change in the world, because this is a commission for us in the church from our Lord and Master and Savior, Jesus Christ, no human authority can tell us not to do it. No human authority can put limits on how much of the Great Commission we carry out. No human authority can put limits on how much of the gospel we preach. Now, some may ask, well, who's putting limits on this, and why are we saying this in the first place? And that's what brings us, brothers and sisters, to some very specific points when it comes to the church's role in the elections. Very specific points that have become very specific battles. Battles, first of all, in the minds of the pastors and of the people to whom they speak. Battles even in legislatures and in courts. There's an irony going on here that while the church is battling for religious freedom and very appropriately standing up for religious freedom in the courts, and we at Priests for Life are very much engaged in that particular battle, we are in the Supreme Court right now with our case against the HHS mandate of the Obama administration. We had a press conference here just before the holidays about that, and insisting that the government cannot force us to provide health insurance coverage for activities that we teach people should not do, nor can they make us part of that whole scheme of the government to increase access to abortion and contraception, even in the very process of opting out of it, that we still become complicit in it. This is a battle for religious freedom in which we are very much engaged, in which many other institutions, not only in the Catholic community but in other Christian communities, are likewise engaged. A number of Catholic dioceses, for example, are joined with us at the Supreme Court in this very case. The irony I want to point out here today is that while on the one hand, the church is very appropriately defending her religious freedom in opposition to mandates from the government that would restrict that freedom, many Catholic institutions and other institutions are at the same time issuing mandates of their own, restricting their own freedom to preach and teach the gospel. What I mean is that each election season, we end up seeing instructions of various kinds and memos of various types coming from dioceses and other Catholic institutions and from other Christian entities as well, somehow telling us that we cannot really participate in the election process by doing, for example, clear teaching and preaching that the people of God have to elect public servants who know the difference between serving the public and killing the public. That among the issues that people have to consider when they examine not only a candidate but a political party, first and foremost is whether that candidate or whether that party intends to carry out the primary purpose of government, to protect the lives of the citizens, to protect the rights of the citizens. That when we take a stand in teaching and preaching what the church has already said in key documents, like the document of Pope St. John Paul II, Evangelium Vitae, the Gospel of Life, and the document of our own Catholic bishops in the United States, Living the Gospel of Life, very clear assertions in these documents that abortion is not just one among many issues, but that it involves the very foundation of every issue, and in fact the very foundation of the state itself. John Paul II wrote in Evangelium Vitae that when a state allows the destruction of unborn children, it becomes a tyrant state. Those are his words. He also said in that same document that the disintegration of the state itself has begun when it permits the violent destruction of babies still in their mother's wombs. The disintegration of the state has begun. That sounds like much more than simply saying this is an incorrect policy or this is a bad court decision. We're talking about the disintegration of the state. We're talking about the transformation of the state from a democracy into a tyranny. And my point is, can the preacher preach this? Well, of course the preacher can preach this, because the preacher is ordained to teach and preach the teachings of the gospel and of the church to which he belongs. And so on the one hand, you cannot ordain somebody and send him out to preach and teach what the church teaches and then somehow put the brakes on and say, but you can't really say this or you can't really say that. Because why? Because of mistaken interpretations of the Johnson Amendment, about which we have legal experts here today who are going to say more, but about which I will simply say this, that we have a law on the books which is being vastly misunderstood, misrepresented, in such a way, whether it's by the fact that we simply do not understand this particular law, or whether it's by the fact that we are using the tax man as an excuse for our own fears and hesitations, whether it be one reason or the other. The fact of the matter is, we have not gotten in our institutional churches a proper understanding of what we really are allowed to do and what we aren't allowed to do. And at the same time, we need to get that proper understanding for the very reasons I've already said, that we always need to have the freedom to do the task we've been given to do by our Lord. Make disciples of all the nations, teach the teachings clearly, and that includes teaching what you do when you go into the voting booth. Let me be a little bit more specific. One of the key tools that we will use in this upcoming election is my recently published book, Abolishing Abortion. And one of the things we have done in this book, we timed it to come out just prior to a major election year, and that's why it was published this past August. And one of the key messages of the book is what I'm saying now, that the church has to have the freedom and exercise the freedom to be much more vocal and active in participating in elections. That's by teaching, by preaching, and by mobilizing the people. Now, we have this Johnson Amendment which says that we are not to intervene as tax-exempt organizations, and churches fall under that category as well, not to intervene directly or indirectly in a political campaign. And the question is, well, what does that really mean? And of course, the law itself doesn't say what it actually means. In order to observe a law, you have to know what it means. In order to adjust your activity and your choices to not violate a particular law, you have to know where that boundary line actually is. In 2008, a study was done on the Johnson Amendment by the Congressional Research Service, and its report stated, quote, "The line between what is prohibited and what is permitted can be difficult to discern." Can be difficult to discern? So you're telling me I can't do something and you're not being clear about what it is that I can't do? That's exactly the problem here. And when somebody is told that they can't do something and then what it is that they cannot do is not specified, the result ends up being something that the Supreme Court itself has acknowledged as a problem, and that is that people begin refraining even from activities that are permitted. And that's to the detriment of the church, that's to the detriment of America, that's to the detriment of the political process. When people don't end up participating because they're afraid that they're breaking some vague, undefined law. And we're saying that it's time for that to stop. We have to be clearer in our understanding of what is and isn't permitted, and then more courageous about carrying out that which is permitted. Now, let me read an example of what I mentioned earlier that comes out sometimes from different entities of the church when it comes to these memos that are circulated, and we'll see this happening in the coming months. Memos and directives from dioceses. I'm going to read one of them here. I quote many of them in my book. And then this one in particular said, Catholic organizations may educate voters about the issues. In addition, they may provide neutral educational forums or information on candidates' positions or make known the church's position on issues. So far, so good. Then the memo goes on to say, indeed, it is the church's right and obligation to make its teachings on moral ideas known, as long as these teachings do not run afoul of the rules on political activity. So in other words, we have this fundamental freedom to teach the gospel, but if some rules on political activity tell us to be quiet about part of it, we have to be quiet. And we're saying, no, we don't. We're saying, no, we can't, if it has to do with the actual teachings of the church. As long as these teachings do not run afoul of the rules on political activity. What kind of rules? In another memo, it says, quote, impermissible activity. Impermissible activity. Number one, do not even appear to endorse or oppose particular candidates for public office or political parties. And I ask you, brothers and sisters, how can anyone carry out that particular piece of advice? How can you not even appear to favor or oppose a candidate who is in favor of child killing throughout pregnancy when you represent a church that says no abortion is ever morally permitted and that the law has to protect children from the beginning of their lives? How do you convey that message and then not even appear to oppose those who are conveying the opposite message? How do you advance a public policy that the bishops of the United States, that the Pope himself, that the church forever has advocated? How do you advance a public policy that says you have to protect human life and not even appear to oppose a political party that says you may destroy human life for any reason or no reason at all throughout all 9 months of pregnancy? How do you do that? And we are saying it is impossible to do that. Of course you're going to appear to be favoring a party or a candidate who has the position that you yourself are articulating. And what we are saying is that the church has the freedom to articulate that position despite the resulting appearances. And let me tell you why appearing to endorse, appearing to favor a particular political party or candidate is not a violation of the nature of the church as nonpartisan, because we are saying that. We are saying that the church is nonpartisan. We're saying, in fact, that the church is transpartisan. The church is beyond and above any particular political party or campaign. Church always has been. Again, we're not saying here that the church should be turned into a political machine endorsing candidates. We are not saying that the church should do the job of political campaigns and parties. As I said at the outset, we're saying the church should do her job. But when the church does her job, she proclaims a message not from the platform of a political party, but from the platform of the gospel. And here's the point. You know that it's a nonpartisan message if it passes the following test. Whatever my message today seems to favor or oppose when it comes to political parties or candidates, what if tomorrow those parties and candidates swapped their positions on abortion? Completely interchanged their platforms and their positions on this issue, so that tomorrow everything was reversed, everything was turned upside down in terms of who stood for what, and who opposed what, and which party's pro-life and which party's pro-choice. You tell me if in that new circumstance tomorrow, my message changes one iota. What word? What sentence? What paragraph of my message or the message of the church changes tomorrow? What part of the document, Living the Gospel of Life, changes tomorrow? If the political parties swap their positions, tell me what changes in Pope John Paul II's Evangelium Vitae. What paragraph has to be edited tomorrow? What pieces of it have to be deleted tomorrow? If the political parties and candidates swap their positions on abortions, you tell me. Because, brothers and sisters, the answer to that question is nothing changes. because our message is not based on a political platform. It's based on the gospel platform, and we have to stop silencing ourselves simply because it seems to favor or oppose some kind of political platform or candidate's position. And yet, there is massive self-censorship going on, and we are calling for it to stop. Massive self-censorship. I believe, not only based on a misunderstanding of the law, but simply based on the fact that we don't want to be criticized. We don't want to be criticized. And if we don't want to be criticized, then we who are proclaiming the gospel probably are in the wrong job. This is a job, in fact, being a disciple of our Lord and bearing witness to the gospel in the ways that all of us do, not just those who preach in the pulpit, but each of us bearing witness in our families, in our professional lives, in our individual activity in any kind of ministry or apostolate, are in fact going to face the criticism that is launched against anyone who stands for and with Jesus Christ. So we are going to engage this year in a number of educational efforts represented again in this book, Abolishing Abortion, educational efforts for the clergy and for the attorneys who advise them by means of seminars, by means of law review articles, by means of healthy, robust discussion and debate that will help people get beyond some of the preconceived notions about what parties limit registration activities in the churches. Voter guides, which are often the subject of so many of these restrictive memos. Voter guides by which the churches and their institutions can actually show the people in black and white what the positions of the specific candidates are. You can do that in such a way that does not constitute prohibited activity. We're going to continue to do that as we've done in previous elections. And we're going to help get people to the polls. We're going to actually do voter mobilization. And we'll talk a little bit more about this later this morning. Let me move on then with our other presenters here. And we have two legal experts who have helped us and so many other people in understanding these matters. First, I want to introduce James Bopp Jr. Jim has been an ally and a friend for many years and over many election cycles. He specializes in First Amendment law, campaign law, constitutional law, election law, and civil litigation. He is one of the most successful attorneys in America in this particular area. He's been named among the 100 most influential lawyers in America. He has received numerous awards. He has served as vice chairman of the Republican National Committee and was on the board of governors of the Republican National Lawyers Association. And he has served as general counsel for the National Right to Life Committee, the James Madison Center for Free Speech, Focus on the Family, the National Legal Center for the Medically Dependent and Disabled, and has provided legal counsel to us at Priests for Life in terms of our election-related activities. I have relied on much of Jim's guidance over the years in writing this book, and I'm very happy that he could participate with us this morning. James Bopp, thank you for being here.
Thank you very much, Father. And Priests for Life and Father Pavone have provided a wonderful service to the church, to the American people, to the Christian community generally, people of faith all over America, by pointing out, both by example, by publishing, by advocating the fact that as bad as the IRS is in terms of their rules and regulations, as vague as they may be, the church actually has way more ability to convey its message to its parishioners than some people are willing to allow it. And of course, he has pointed out in his book the fact that Unfortunately, many of the lawyers for the Catholic Church have provided advice that goes way beyond even the wildest imagination of the people for separation of church and state, as far as they would want to restrict the church in terms of limiting activity. An excellent example Father Provone gave was the fact that the IRS has actually provided fairly specific legal advice on voter guides and what kind of voter guides a C3 organization can distribute. Even in the face of what is an area of very specific legal advice by the IRS that is widely relied upon and successfully relied upon by many C3 organizations to do examination of the Internal Revenue than legal advice from lawyers. That is one example. Another example is requiring dioceses and churches to run off of their public parking lots any volunteer that might come onto the parking lot to distribute literature. How possibly can a church be responsible for someone that they have no idea that is coming, didn't give permission to appear, and is doing something that is completely irrelevant to the church, and in fact is probably, in some instances, exercising their First Amendment right to distribute literature in a public place. In other instances might be trespassers. But how could that volunteer, unapproved, unknowing activity be the responsibility of a church? These are examples of advice that go way beyond anything that the IRS has ever suggested they would have a problem with. Well, but it's not that there's not a problem. And of course the problem is the vagueness of the Internal Revenue Service's interpretation of its own statute. But there is a silver lining as well. One that needs to be understood so that lawyers who seek to give legal advice in this area, understand that there is way more latitude than the IRS's bluster, threats, and in some cases harassment. Well, of course, it begins with the prohibition on political intervention. A C3 may not intervene directly or indirectly in a political campaign. And of course, what is intervention? It seems very, very broad and very vague. The IRS then adopted regulations where they could have given bright line guidance to what that means, so that people in advance can know what they're to do or not to do. Unfortunately, they used phraseology that just compounded the ambiguities. He said that political intervention means, quote, influencing or attempting to influence, quote, an election for public office. And of course, the phrase influencing or attempting to influence is one that the U.S. Supreme Court in 1976 in Buckley versus Vallejo specifically condemned as being certain communications that would, by their express terms or in explicit words, advocate the election defeat of a clearly identified candidate. Well, despite that interpretation, despite that narrowing gloss that the court gave on those words, the IRS has been adamant that they will not adopt a bright line test, as the U.S. Supreme Court said in 1976, is required under the First Amendment, is required by the Constitution of the United States, and that they will insist upon what they have termed to be a facts and circumstances test, one in which the facts and circumstances of the communication will be looked to decide whether or not it is political intervention. Well, pointing to the facts and circumstances really doesn't tell you what facts, what circumstances are relevant or pertinent. And of course, it would be the facts and circumstances obviously, it wouldn't be the astrological signs, that people would look to decide whether or not a particular communication intervenes in a political campaign. Obviously, it would be the facts and circumstances. So telling one that tells one nothing about what it is those standards are. Well, they have, as I have mentioned, given advice through various revenue rulings. They have been given fairly specific advice in 2 revenue rulings regarding voter guides and voter educational material, ones that have proven to be fairly, the groups have been fairly successful in following and adhering to. And as a result, many C3 organizations, including churches, do voter guides that are perfectly acceptable for distribution at any church in the United States. They have done some revenue rulings on candidate debates, both by not-for-profit organizations and by media outlets. And again, these seems to have been fairly successfully adhered to, and because of their specificity. However, with respect to communications generally, we really have a problem. In 2004, they issued a revenue ruling reiterating the fact that they have no bright lines, that they will use the facts and circumstances test. And in 2004, that revenue ruling applied to C4, C5, and C6 organizations. They identified 6 positive factors that one could look to see whether the particular communication was political intervention or not, and pointed to then also 5 negative factors, one of which was the absence of any positive factor, as if you could have a circumstance with no positive factors, but it still be considered political intervention. Then in 2007, they issued another revenue ruling. In this case, it addressed a broader category of types of political speech, but when they got down to communications, they had 3 scenarios, and they identified, specifically identified 7 factors that they considered to be relevant to this consideration. Remember, 3 years before, they had 11 factors. Now they're down to 7. 4 have somehow or another disappeared. And one of the new factors, there was actually a new factor that they introduced, one that they said was the most important factor. One that was not even mentioned 3 years ago becomes 3 years later the most important and relevant factor, and that is proximity to an election in terms of the communication. So they didn't tell us, though, whether the one in 2004 has now been superseded by the one in 2005. Are we to add these all factors together, mix them up? They didn't tell us how many of these factors had to be present, either positive or negative, what weight they would give to any individual factor, and it just became perfectly obvious that this is an exercise in pretend to give legal advice as to what you can do, because what you will be judged is ex post facto and ad hoc in terms of their determination after the fact, whether or not you've engaged in political intervention. Of course, at the same time, we were experiencing, I was representing the Christian Coalition, and it took them 9 years to decide that the coalition was not actually a C4 organization, using these very vague standards on whether or not an organization complies. They were sued. As soon as they got to court, bingo, they're writing us a check to send back the taxes that they had assessed against the organization. And when the judge said, well, that's not enough, they still are entitled to their exemption for the years that were challenged in court, the IRS said, well, of course. They were a C4 organization during those challenged years. In 3 other cases I've handled, we sued the IRS after they had imposed the tax and drug the organization through the entire appeals process. We filed for the return of the, in each case, few $100s that they had assessed as taxes. 6 months after that is filed, on literally the last day of the last moment that we could then go to court, they issued a refund to the organization. In other words, the IRS is exhibiting a lot of tyrannical characteristics. They threaten, they bully, they drag you in some cases through administrative process, but they are loath to be subject to review by the courts. They know, as I know, that if they ever got into court with this utterly vague and hostile application of regulations to core political speech in the United States, that they would lose. So they literally move heaven and earth to make sure that they avoid accountability to the courts and to the Constitution. Now, when will they go to court or allowed to be dragged to court? It's, you know, in those three instances where everybody would agree you're intervening in a political campaign. You take church property and you give it to a candidate for his campaign. You're making a contribution to the candidate. 2, you have an assembly and you pass the hat for the candidate's campaign. You're using your church for a candidate's fundraiser. And 3rd, if the church, using church property, would endorse a candidate's election, advocate the election or defeat of a candidate. In those 3 instances, everyone would agree is political intervention. Those are the only instances the IRS has ever permitted itself to be dragged into court for review. In all other instances, and there's others that I have handled as well, where they move heaven and earth to prevent judicial review. So what does that tell us then about what we are facing? Yes, we are facing a demonstrably hostile IRS, hostile to political activity by the citizens generally and not-for-profits specifically. We know that that IRS is perfectly willing to engage in partisan enforcement of their political intervention regime, as demonstrated when they targeted the Tea Party organizations for specially adverse treatment who applied for C4 status in order to elect a particular person for President of the United States. We know that we have that type of organization, and we know that we have laws that they have instituted that are vague. But we also know that we have an organization that is fearful beyond measure of being held accountable in the courts and to the United States Constitution. So in that circumstance, if an organization, particularly religious organizations, believe that it is their calling to inform their flock of moral principles or obligations of civic participation, or of simply the public service of what is the positions of candidates on the moral issues that the church considers important. Why would such an organization unduly restrict themselves when they know that they are dealing with an organization, despite all its bluster and harassment, will never, ever allow itself to be overruled by a court? Why would such an organization take these admittedly vague rules and take them beyond anybody's comprehension as far as restricting the activities? The moral teachings of the church are to be restricted because of this fear. Does anybody actually think for one instant that if one church, one Catholic church, say in my hometown, Zionsville, Indiana, would distribute a C3 compliant voter guide by somebody, let's say Catholic Answers, that has been specifically picked out as a prohibited voter guide, but does a C3 compliant voter guide, and I know that, I represented them, the IRS approved their voter guide, that if they distribute it because of volunteers going on to the parking lot of that church without the consent of the church, that the entire Catholic Church's C3 exemption would be revoked. Does anybody in their right mind think that that is even a remote possibility, even in the recently most hostile IRS that we've ever had in terms of its political, partisan political bent? It's ridiculous proposition, but it is one that is unfortunately seemingly motivating this restrictive advice. Well, there are ways of fixing this, and you will hear really two approaches. My approach is one that doesn't focus on the religious aspect, but focuses on the free speech and association aspect of all C3s. And that is that they are entitled to bright lines, not vague laws. And because we're dealing with core political speech, you're entitled, as the court has regularly said, to a bright line rule so you will know in advance whether what you say impinges on any rules. The Supreme Court has already said that influence has to mean, under the Constitution, expressly advocating the election or defeat of a clearly identified candidate. That works perfectly well in campaign finance rules, and it is the rule that ought to be adopted with respect to the Internal Revenue Service. The different second problem is whether or not the whole organization is to be considered political if they engage in some political activity. And here the IRS says if it's your primary purpose, and of course what they mean is they think an organization can have multiple primary purposes, and if one of them happens to be turns out to be intervention in a political campaign, well then the whole group becomes a political organization, which is what's called a 527, and of course there's consequences there. You've got to report all your donors, all your expenditures to the IRS in public filings, where C3 and C4 organizations, of course, don't have to do that, and their donors are confidential. So there are certainly consequences to whether or not you're a political organization. Well, that's a problem solved already by the Supreme Court in Buckley versus Vallejo and subsequent cases, which is it has to be your, quote, major purpose. There can only be one major purpose. What you spend more than 50% of your money on, that's your major purpose, and if it's political intervention properly understood, well then you can be deemed to be a political committee. Well, those would be bright lines that have been very successfully imposed because of the First Amendment and successfully used in campaign finance rules, both state and federal, all over the country. These are the very kind of rules the IRS should be following. The IRS should not be involved in deciding what is political. We've already seen demonstrably that they are incapable of doing that in a way that explains it to anybody, and is perfectly prepared to take partisan approach to this question. That should not be their area of concern. Now you will hear about when we add to this whole dynamic the freedom, the free exercise of religion.
Jim, thank you very much. I want to introduce now another representative of an organization that has been a great ally to us and to so many other churches and church-related organizations, and that is the Alliance Defending Freedom, represented here today by legal counsel Christiana Holcomb. She is a member of the church team of ADF, and since joining ADF in 2012, she's worked to protect the religious freedom of churches, Christian schools, and Christian ministries. She advocates also for these issues as a faculty member of the Alliance Defending Freedom Regional Legal Academy and speaks at various conferences across the country. Christiana, we are delighted to have you here today, and thank you for sharing in this press conference.
Well, thank you very much. It is a delight to be with you all today, and Father Frank, we are so delighted to be here and to stand with you on this very, very important issue. The issue we're discussing today is one of ultimate importance. The sanctity of human life is literally a matter of life and death to millions of our brothers, unborn brothers and sisters. It's a gospel issue. It's a human rights issue. And yet it's an issue upon which so many pastors across the nation are absolutely silent. Pastors and churches often self-censor because they fear that discussing abortion could be labeled political and be punished by the IRS. But it hasn't always been this way. Historically, churches have been at the forefront of many of the great social and political movements of our history. American independence, abolition, women's suffrage, civil rights. Pastors spoke out clearly whenever moral issues intersected with political issues. Pastors even preached about candidates for political office, and commonly by name. They publicly endorsed and opposed candidates using biblical principles to help guide and shepherd their congregations to make biblically sound decisions in that election. But all that changed on July 2nd, 1954. Then Senator Lyndon Johnson was embroiled in a vicious re-election campaign and was determined to silence two secular nonprofit organizations that he believed was damaging his chance of being re-elected. And after learning from the IRS commissioner that these nonprofits were not breaking any law by their political involvement, Johnson made a power move. He introduced an amendment to federal tax law, section 501c3, to make illegal what, up until that point, had been perfectly legal. The Johnson Amendment stated that all nonprofit organizations, which includes churches, cannot, quote, participate in or intervene in, including the publishing or distributing of statements, any political campaign on behalf of or in opposition to any candidate for political office, unquote. The amendment was passed without debate, without committee hearings, and without any legislative analysis to determine whether it was even constitutional as applied to churches. In sum, the Johnson Amendment was a backroom power politics and political maneuver at its absolute worst. It was not instituted for the betterment of the political process. It was a deal designed to silence a powerful senator's political opponents. So the Johnson Amendment, in the 60 years since it was instituted, has essentially ushered in a regime of censorship. It is clearly a speech restriction since it relates, again, to publishing or distributing statements. And as Jim Bob mentioned earlier, according to decades of black and white Supreme Court law, any speech restriction must be defined with precision to be constitutional and avoid violating the First Amendment. The Johnson Amendment doesn't come remotely close to meeting even these basic constitutional standards. No one, including legal experts or tax experts, can define with any certainty the absolute parameters of the Johnson Amendment and what it means to participate in or intervene in a campaign for political office. To make matters even worse, it's the notorious IRS who has been charged with enforcing the Johnson Amendment. And this highly political government agency has exploited the vagueness of that law to silence the church on important issues of our day. The IRS has admitted that, well, where there is no explicit endorsement, it doesn't have a bright line test, as you heard earlier, as it's required to have to be constitutional. Instead, IRS agents are given the authority to look at all the facts and circumstances, whatever that means, of each case, and then proclaim whether some nebulous line has or has not been crossed. Think about it. As a result of Johnson's political shenanigans, we have given IRS bureaucrats police power over the First Amendment. It's absolutely absurd. And it's the only law of its kind that gives a government agent the power to censor what a pastor says from the pulpit. Predictably, the IRS has used that power to intimidate pastors into silence by threatening to revoke the tax-exempt status of their churches or impose harsh penalties on their churches for crossing that line. Complicating matters even further is the IRS's arbitrary and capricious enforcement of the Johnson Amendment. Some pastors publicly endorse candidates from their pulpits year after year. Did you know that? With utter impunity. The IRS is silent, does nothing. Other pastors make a passing reference to what Jesus might say to a candidate, and they're subjected to a rigorous 27-month IRS investigation. In the 60-year history of the Johnson Amendment, a few churches, just a handful, have been subjected to these types of investigations. And frankly, the IRS claims to have 99 more churches that is investigating. We're trying to get to the bottom of it, but again, everything that it does is shrouded in secrecy. But not a single church has permanently lost its tax-exempt status, and not a single church has lost its tax-exempt status, period, for anything that a pastor has said from his pulpit. But nevertheless, this has fostered such an atmosphere nationwide of intimidation and fear and arbitrary enforcement that the pastors themselves self-censor. The IRS doesn't have to do the censoring because the pastors themselves censor what they say from the pulpit. After all, if legal scholars, tax experts, and even the IRS itself can't determine the parameters of the Johnson Amendment, how in the world is a pastor to do so? Pastors want to be law-abiding citizens. They don't want to jeopardize the exemption of their church or risk financially ruinous legal penalties. So they end up moving so far away from that line of legality and any questionably political speech that they engage in massive self-censorship. Can pastors discuss their elected officials' positions on issues? Yes. Can they engage in voter registration activities and get out the vote activities? Yes. Can they urge their elected officials to vote a certain way? Yes. Can they speak about issues like the sanctity of human life and abortion from their pulpits? Absolutely yes. But do they? Generally, no. Because they feel stifled. They don't feel at liberty to speak freely to their congregations, even when moral issues of grave importance that strike at the heart of the gospel, like the sanctity of life and abortion, are at issue. And in light of the IRS's scare tactics, frankly, their reluctance is understandable. Pastors will continue to self-censor as long as the Johnson Amendment is on the books. So it's time to fix that primary barrier to pastors fully engaging on cultural issues. It's time to fix the Johnson Amendment. Whether by court order or by congressional action, this is not a should, but it is a must as it comes to free speech. No court has yet had the opportunity, as was mentioned, to decide the constitutionality of the Johnson Amendment as applied to what a pastor says from his pulpit. Given the opportunity, we firmly believe that a court would absolutely strike it down as unconstitutional, not only on the grounds of free speech, but the exercise of religion as an unconstitutional condition on receiving a tax exemption and the Religious Freedom Restoration Act. But unfortunately, the IRS holds all the cards when it comes to getting into court and with whom, because there's a federal law that prohibits us from suing the IRS outright. So in 2008, Alliance Defending Freedom launched its Pulpit Initiative, designed to encourage pastors to exercise their constitutional freedoms and apply Scripture to every aspect of life. We know the Scripture speaks, at least in principle, to every aspect of life, including candidates, their positions, and elections. And we wanted to invite the IRS to test the constitutionality of its procedures in federal court. Some pastors even sent courtesy copies of their sermons to the IRS, just to ensure they were aware. But the initiative, look, is not about turning candidates into political action committees or allowing contributions to candidates or advancing the agenda of a particular political party or candidate. But it is about ensuring that pastors have the freedom to speak from their pulpits and preach the whole counsel of God. Since 2008, well over 4,000 pastors and churches have joined Alliance Defending Freedom in proclaiming that the Johnson Amendment must end and the IRS's reign of tyranny must end. Many preached election sermons, and some even endorsed and opposed candidates by name. but the IRS has refused to risk that legal challenge. It prefers this murky atmosphere of intimidation and self-censorship rather than risking that court challenge, which might force it to clarify its procedures, because it undoubtedly knows it is on dangerous constitutional ground. So, it's also time to pursue a legislative fix. James Bopp has recommended one type of legislative fix. Another one was offered in 2013 by the Evangelical Council for Financial Accountability, the ECFA. It published a report urging Congress to fix the Johnson Amendment. It had convened a broad spectrum of legal experts, nonprofit sector representatives, religious leaders, and thought leaders to discuss the issue. And they proposed an amendment that would provide a free speech valve or safe harbor for free speech. Here's the recommendation in a nutshell. Unless the speech both costs the nonprofit and uses express words of advocacy, like vote for or vote against candidate X, the speech would not violate federal tax law. The bottom line is it would get the IRS out of the business of being speech police, and most importantly, get the IRS out of American pulpits. No bill has yet been introduced, but it's time to get bill language, to push the legislative fix through Congress, and to stop muzzling American pastors. But in conclusion, we know pastors and their congregations should have the sole authority to decide what is preached from the pulpit. It's outrageous for religious leaders across our nation to be threatened and intimidated by the government for simply applying biblical teaching to all areas of life, including elections. We will not end the evils of our time, including the scourge of abortion, unless the church engages, unless the church courageously fulfills her role to be the moral conscience of the nation, unless the church becomes that voice for the voiceless. Life issues strike at the heart and the core of the exercise of religion. It's first and foremost a moral issue and a religious issue. The church cannot surrender her freedom to speak on moral issues simply because the politics of our day has rendered it, quote unquote, political. We at Alliance Defending Freedom are here to say that if a law prevents churches from speaking out and intimidates pastors into silence, that law must be fixed. And to notify pastors that we're here for you and we'll defend your right to speak freely from your pulpit. But Father Frank has outlined in his book what the church must do moving forward if we are to end the scourge of abortion. It's time for the church to fulfill that calling and to be that voice for the voiceless. Thank you.
Before we take any questions you may have, I would like to ask our executive director to come forward for a few comments, because as I mentioned at the outset, Priests for Life does have a wide variety of activities that we will carry out during this election year, and that plan is shaping up. One of our key advisors is also here, Dr. Diehl Hudson, and we're grateful for his work over many election cycles to implement the kind of things we're saying here, and we will be working with him closely in this current election cycle. But Janet Morana has been involved with Priests for Life since its very inception in the early 1990s, and oversees the various projects of our organization. She is also an author and speaker herself. She wrote the book called Recall Abortion, and is on television on EWTN, producing several different series which deal with these election-related issues very extensively and explicitly. So Janet, welcome, and we welcome your remarks.
Thank you, Father, and I'll be very brief. Just to let you know that our team, which of course includes Father Pavone, myself, Father Stephen Ambarano, Dr. Alvita King, Kevin Berg, Teresa Berg, Brian Kemper, will be out on the road this year, really making ourselves available to speak in churches, at conferences, at banquets and events. So we can also clearly define the most important issue here in this coming election, which is abortion. And if a candidate cannot, as Father said, respect the life of a little baby, how can he respect ours? And we're going to be very clear on this. We have a special website, politicalresponsibility.com, and I encourage you to visit that website. We will have all the information you need to know to get involved. I will be working very closely with Dr. Diehl Hudson, who is now part of our team as a consultant this year. And Diehl Hudson and I worked very closely in the 2004 election on the Catholic outreach to re-elect President Bush. and we know how to get the ground game going. And we are going to have a new program we're going to be introducing, Drivers for Life. So again, you'll just go to politicalresponsibility.com where you can sign up, because the ground game this year is going to be very important. Early voting is going to be key. Defining the issues with the candidates is going to be key. And we will have, once the conventions are over, a C3 friendly voters guide, which we will have on that website to download free of charge. And we are going to get rid of the kick out of the parking lot Sunday, because we're going to have our people out there on the ground game. And no matter what, Drivers for Life, distributing the voters guides, etc. We are going to get a pro-life candidate back in the White House so that we can bring the end to abortion in our nation. We don't want abortion to be just illegal or legal or illegal. We want it to be unthinkable choice for any people facing an unplanned pregnancy. So we're going to fight hard, and I think we will win because we have God on our side. Thank you.
Any of our presenters today or I would be happy to answer any particular questions that you might have based on what we said. Deal.
I've always wondered, when I hear lay people, leaders, pastors, bishops, and so forth, cite the IRS restrictions of vagueness, which I now understand a lot better hearing Jim and Christiana. Whether they just use that as an excuse because it's really not in their gut to proclaim the life issue and the inviolability of unborn life. I mean, I'm not asking you to name names, but I'm just wondering, what's your impression of what's out there? Is it really fear of being brought to task and investigated by the IRS, or in many cases it's just a convenient excuse?
Yes, I think there are a number of things going on. I do see a lot of fear and hesitation among the clergy, not about having the IRS come in, but rather about the criticism they will face from their parishioners or some prominent parishioner who's a donor, who is also an avid Democrat supporter, coming up and saying, well, you've offended me and our party and our candidates and our platform and they don't know how to deal with that opposition. On an emotional and personal level, they don't know how to deal with it very often. And the dynamics going on here, I think, are several. There's a fundamental fear, a lack of self-confidence that then we run to the tax guy to hide behind, to convince ourselves that we really don't have to engage in what we find so threatening or uncomfortable. Secondly, there is a massive ignorance about the state of the law, and feeding into that massive ignorance then and making the problem worse are some of these directives and memos that we have referred to and quoted here that will again come out this season. And again, that only makes matters worse because the pastors don't know how to make heads or tails of what the legal limits really are. Then I think a third dynamic that's happening is very simply political loyalty. We have within the church many very authentic, very important social programs and priorities that are being pursued. And in the midst of pursuing them, and then these also are implementations of the gospel and of the church's social teaching, but in the midst of pursuing a lot of these programs and projects, friendships and loyalties and collaborative relationships are developed with leaders in this other also very important social priority of protecting the unborn. And I think a lot of folks in the church find themselves, and in the clergy, find themselves torn in this particular way. And I think that's part of what's happening as well. So either of you want to add to what Deal's question? Okay, thanks, Deal, for that.
I want to follow on.
Yeah.
I think about 3 weeks ago, there was a conference in the Vatican, and our mutual friend, Father Robert Periscope, was sitting in there, and a cardinal, I won't name him, sitting next to him, explicitly said that climate change was just as important an issue as abortion. Now, of course, Chirico jumped on that, as did a lot of people in the press, but doesn't it create an atmosphere of confusion among Catholics who read? I mean, a lot of Catholics don't read any news at all, but that kind of thing has a tendency to filter its way down.
You know, there are several things that have not changed. One is the arithmetic. Nothing claims more human life than abortion, as we know. Not cancer, not AIDS, not heart disease, not poverty, not war, not terrorism, not capital punishment, certainly not climate change. Nothing takes more human lives than abortion. The arithmetic hasn't changed. The second thing that hasn't changed is the logic. Every other right, every other good that we possess depends on life itself. If you don't have life, you don't have anything at all. If you destroy the life of the baby, you've destroyed his or her education, healthcare, housing, employment, protection from terrorism, protection from climate change. You've destroyed everything for that person by that one act of violence known as abortion. The logic hasn't changed. Every other right depends on life. And the third thing that hasn't changed is the teaching. Explicitly in Evangelium Vitae by John Paul II, and in our own bishop's document, Living the Gospel of Life, and in many other documents of the Church, it has been laid out clearly that abortion is among the moral issues worthy of urgent priority and attention. And that phrase, urgent priority and attention, is contained in our own bishop's pastoral plan for pro-life activities that has been in effect for many years. The latest version of it was issued in 2001 and is still valid today. So for somebody to say that climate change is as important as abortion. Let's put aside whatever title the person has who said it, whatever position they hold, or whatever garments they wear. It's absurd and needs to be challenged as absurd. And this, of course, is part of the educational activity that we've been engaged in all these election cycles, is to show why we put urgent priority and attention on abortion. Not because it's the only issue, but because the right to life is the core of every issue. That's why. Janet is telling me our time is up. Listen, we are grateful for the participation of all of you, media outlets here, both television, radio, and print, internet outlets who have come to join us. Our legal experts, again, James Bopp and Christiana Holcomb, thank you very much for not only being here, but we look forward to continuing to work with you throughout the year. And all of you, brothers and sisters, thanks a lot. We'll be available for follow-up personal conversations. And again, contact us at politicalresponsibility.com as this election cycle proceeds. Thanks for